Hello, and thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report on NTD television. I'm Steve Lance. Here's a look at some of the stories we've been following for you today. Is a de-escalation coming? President Biden today gives an update on the situation in Ukraine. This, as Russia says it's pulling back some of their troops. Revelations that the Clinton campaign allegedly spied on the Trump White House are sending shockwaves through Washington, D.C. But the question remains, where is the coverage from the mainstream media? Starting today, you can eat out in the nation's capital without a vaccine card. We speak to business owners to find out how the mandate has impacted them and how locals and tourists feel about the news.
I'm probably like 50-50 on that.
I think it was more of a political thing all along.
The latest on Ukraine. President Biden spoke today as Russia claims it's pulling some troops from the border. Is a de-escalation coming? NTD's Iris Tao with more on that.
We should give the diplomacy every chance to succeed. And I believe there are real ways to address our respective security concerns.
Addressing the nation on the evolving Ukraine-Russia crisis, President Biden on Tuesday sounded optimistic that diplomacy can solve it. The speech comes after Russia announced Tuesday that it's pulling back some troops near the Ukrainian border after completing drills. But Biden said the U.S. has not verified that.
Our analysts indicate that they remain very much in a threatening position. And the fact remains, right now, Russia has more than 150,000 troops encircling Ukraine and Belarus and along Ukraine's border. An invasion remains distinctly possible.
Putin, meanwhile, insisted on Tuesday that he does not want a war.
Do we want war or not? Of course not. That is why we have offered our proposals to start the negotiation process.
He said Russia is ready to talk with the U.S. and NATO about potential missile deployment limits. But as for what Russia will do next,
according to the plan, and how the plan will be made, according to the actual situation.
The Ukrainian foreign minister, meanwhile, said they will only believe Russia is trying to de-escalate if they actually see proof.
We won't believe it when we hear it. We will believe it when we see it. When we see the troops pulling out, we will believe in de-escalation.
NATO on Tuesday also remained skeptical.
There are signs from Moscow that diplomacy should continue. This gives grounds for cautious optimism. But so far, we have not seen any sign of de-escalation on the ground.
Meanwhile, Russia said Tuesday they will deliver a written response to proposals by the U.S. and NATO within the coming days. Reporting in D.C., Iris Tao, NTD News.
The vote on Federal Reserve nominees was stalled today. Republican members on the Senate Banking Committee say that they need more information about one of the nominees, Sarah Bloom Raskin. Republicans are questioning Raskin's relationship with a Colorado-based firm that gained access to the Fed's payment system. Republican Senator Patrick Toomey said that they're willing to vote on Biden's 4 other picks. Democrats control the committee, but with no single Republican attending the session, the vote has to be delayed, including the vote on Fed Chair Jerome Powell's second term. Sarah Bloom Raskin is the wife of current Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin. New evidence has surfaced in the Durham investigation that alleges the Clinton campaign took measures to spy on President Trump. This in an effort to create a narrative linking Trump to Russia. At this point, there is still much that has not been released, but to help us get an understanding of where we are now, we have Mark MECKLER, who is president of Convention of States. Mark MECKLER, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Glad to be with you.
Now, Mark, I want to get your thoughts on the recent findings in the Durham investigation. Allegedly, the Clinton campaign tapped into Trump's servers both at Trump Tower and at the White House and was attempting to make a link between Trump and Russia. Just how big of a deal is this, despite the very little coverage we're seeing from mainstream media?
I think it's an extraordinarily big deal. We've heard for years and years, for decades, this is the next Watergate. This is bigger than Watergate. I think this is way bigger than Watergate. I mean, what you're talking about is a presidential campaign paying money, committing espionage against another presidential campaign, using the government to do so, actually feeding information to the FBI, to the CIA, These are extraordinary revelations, and they also continued to do it after the president became the sitting president of the United States, doing it through the executive office of the president. These are very, very serious allegations, and I hope that if proven true, people go to jail.
Now, Mark, I want to ask you, how were they even able to execute this with such brazenness? Doesn't this raise more questions about the deep state that Trump used to refer to? And what is your interpretation of the deep state? Who are they? How does this apparatus function?
I think it does raise more questions about the deep state. The way they were able to conduct this is there was a third-party contractor that worked for the federal government that had access to these servers and the DNS, the domain name server information, and that's how they were able to get access to this data. And then what you're seeing here is a closed loop, and the deep state really is a closed loop. I think it's broader than just saying bureaucrats or administrative agencies. It is a combination of the Democrat Party, long-term operatives inside the federal government, employees of the federal government, frankly, in every department, but in this case, specifically inside the CIA and the FBI, and then the Democrat media complex. And all of that together makes up a closed loop that allows somebody to go in, get information, feed that information to government agencies, feed it to the media, and creating a closed loop narrative that probably cost President Trump his second term.
Now, Mark, why is the media so mum on this topic, and where do you see this going? Do you think people will go to jail, like you mentioned earlier, and will the media inevitably be forced to report on this?
I think the media is so mum on the topic because, as I described it, they're part of that closed loop. So when you look at the left-wing media complex, the major media outlets, NBC, CBS, ABC, and the like, they're part of the narrative. They hated Trump. They were willing to do anything they could to take down Trump. Before he was elected, during his presidency, and during the reelect, they went after him hard. And so I don't think they're interested in reporting on it. They're not interested in saying how wrong they were on the Russia collusion narrative. There was indeed collusion. It was to create a false narrative that Trump was somehow in bed with Russia. As far as whether anybody will actually be prosecuted, whether people will go to jail, let's just say my hopes aren't high. I've been involved in the political game since about 2009. I was involved in the Tea Party movement. I saw Lois Lerner targeting folks for the exercise of their First Amendment rights. The Inspector General's report made it very clearly that that's what happened, and nobody paid a price. So I generally don't see public officials at a high level pay a price for these kinds of misdeeds.
Mark Meckler, thank you.
Thank you.
Congresswoman Kathleen Rice said Tuesday that she will not be seeking re-election this fall. She becomes the 30th Democrat to announce they're leaving Congress before the November midterms. Congresswoman Rice announced her plans on her 57th birthday. In a 2-paragraph statement, she didn't specify why she was leaving. She has represented New York's 4th congressional district just outside of New York City for 4 terms. So far, only 13 House Republicans have said that they will not be seeking re-election. Starting today, you can eat out in the nation's capital, and businesses can welcome customers without asking for proof of vaccination. Business owners tell us they've struggled while the mandate was in effect, and they're hopeful the return to normalcy will bring some customers back. And Washington residents and tourists have mixed feelings about the news. Our reporter Melina Wisecup brings us more from downtown D.C.
Washington, D.C. is the latest in a string of cities to change course on virus restrictions. The vaccine mandate in the heart of the nation was short-lived, only 1 month, in effect from January to February. From today, the city is not forcing businesses to ask their customers for proof of vaccination, a relief for some business owners.
It's a funny feeling. To ask people, they feel like you're taking some of their rights, and we lose a lot of business. When they have the mask on, I thought it was enough, They can't go in, they just leave,
He says that's especially the case for tourists, because if they come from a mandate-free state, carrying a vaccination card can be out of the ordinary. And some businesses are already seeing the impact. The general manager of this restaurant tells me they've seen more lunch reservations today than they've seen over the past month. Now business owners can decide for themselves whether to keep the vaccine mandate or to drop it. What do you think you'll do and why?
We have been considering whatever the government has suggested since the CDC recommendations and everybody's recommendations since the beginning. And so we'll follow the guidelines of the government. Makes it a little better for the guests to understand what they're walking into.
And how do residents and tourists feel about the news?
I'm probably like 50-50 on that. I went to brunch about a week ago and it was empty. It wasn't the same. So I get it. But at the same time, is it the safest thing to do right now in the middle of like that cold season? I'm not sure.
I think it's a person's right to choose whether or not they want to be vaccinated or not. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. My children are vaccinated. But yeah, no, I think it's great that you don't have to worry about showing your papers, quote unquote, to get into an eating establishment.
But others have grim expectations.
I do not think that they should be lifting those requirements. The cases are going to go back up. Hopefully it doesn't exceed into other cases.
Mayor Bowser made the decision citing vaccinations are up and hospitalizations are down. But was there a political motivation in the mix?
I think it was more of a political thing all along.
It got politicized last year by both parties. Very frustrated with that.
These days, everything is so polarized. Can you really be one side or the other? I think there's always a mixture of feelings.
And starting on March 1st, they won't have to require masks either. But for places like schools, childcare facilities, and government buildings, masks will still be required for now. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
Wholesale prices surging again in January at twice the pace of market expectations. It's an indication that prices will continue to rise across the country. One crisis after another, and Ukraine has been dominating the news cycle. But with new data coming in, inflation continues to plague America with a bleak economic outlook. Some Senate Republicans are making a formal move to reopen the U.S. Capitol building to the public. The building has been closed to visitors since mid-March 2020 due to the CCP virus. Hello and welcome back to NTD's Capital Report. Wholesale prices accelerated again in January. That's a fresh sign of the relentless pressure of inflation hitting the United States economy. Today, the Labor Department said that wholesale prices rose to nearly 10% this month on an annual basis. This is slightly below the 12-year record high in November and December, but it's still double what Wall Street had predicted.
Something disruptive going on in the world that further impedes supply lines that are being repaired, we're likely to see the rate of inflation become a bit more muted, but it will keep rising.
Cohen says pandemic fatigue, along with the instability in Eastern Europe, make it difficult to predict what will happen next for the U.S. economy. Gas prices are another contributing factor to inflation. Average prices topped $3.48 per gallon last week. That's nearly $1 more than just a year ago. To address people's frustration over high inflation, the White House and Democrats are looking at options. And as we just mentioned, the data is in, and the economic outlook for the United States is still in flux. With wholesale prices skyrocketing in the month of January, many are wondering where the economy is heading. Our next guest definitely has some answers. We're happy to have senior economic analyst for Bankrate.com, Mark Hamrick, here with us to discuss. Mark Hamrick, thank you so much for joining us on the Capital Report.
Thank you, Steve. Good to be with you.
Now, Mark, we're seeing all sorts of key indicators that inflation is continuing to surge. Wholesale prices have just jumped almost 10% in January alone. It's really an incredible number. What is this telling you about where we are and where we're heading?
Well, first of all, Steve, we think about the fact that inflation has been more significant and more persistent than what had been expected. And this has caught essentially all stakeholders off guard. And those stakeholders are consumers. Those people are businesses, business leaders, obviously investors, and ultimately policymakers. And at the top of that list, policymakers, we think about our own central bankers in the United States. But on a personal finance level, this is causing pain, really, for households and individuals, in the sense that those of moderate or lower income have less flexibility and fewer resources to deal with rising prices, and some, no doubt, are having to go without, in a sense, particularly when food and energy, transportation have been leading the way on these rising prices.
Now, I'd just like to ask you about gas prices. Every gallon of gas we pump has an associated tax built in that gets paid to the federal government. Congressional Democrats are looking to offer a gas tax holiday for the remainder of the year, which will take roughly about 18 cents per gallon off of each gallon of gas. Do you see this as a viable solution to offsetting inflation?
Well, I don't know that that's going to be the silver bullet that essentially alleviates the inflation pressures that we're all experiencing. But obviously, at an absolute level, that is something that gets subtracted from what people pay at the pump. It feels to me like more of a political move than something that is tremendously effective. But I would say the other part of that is, to the first point, anything that reduces the impact of those high costs on individuals ends up being welcome. It also has a detrimental impact in the sense of the fact that those gasoline taxes go to the federal government, which is already running debts and deficits.
Now, many financial experts are saying that one of the main ways to rein in inflation is for the Fed to raise interest rates. When do you expect that to happen, and are there any other measures that you think might be helpful?
We need to look at what the Federal Reserve does in a couple of different contexts. And first of all, think about the fact that the Federal Reserve, along with elected officials in Washington, when we're thinking about the U.S. response, were really fairly early in responding to the economic downturn, the brief recession that occurred as the pandemic took hold and took the economy with it. And so what the Fed did was essentially a number of things, but among the extraordinary measures it took was to move interest rates to record low levels and also engaged in $120 billion in monthly asset purchases. So it's essentially raising its balance sheet, expanding its balance sheet, as well as moving interest rates to essentially as low as practically they can be without getting into the negative interest rate scenario. And so it has essentially continued in that state up until the current time, and has continued to add to its balance sheet, has been drawing down those asset purchases, but they're not yet at zero. So here we are with inflation, whether measured at the retail or wholesale level, at either 7.5% or close to 10%, and the Fed is still adding accommodation through record low interest rates and expanding its balance sheet. So the question really is, what should the Fed be doing? And it ought, in the minds of many, to at least get back to neutral. We're not really sure where neutral is, because the balance sheet is now at $8.8 trillion and interest rates, as we said, are very low. But that benchmark interest rate needs to go higher, and we would expect that to happen as soon as the next meeting's conclusion, which would be March 16th. And the expectation is that that would be the first in a series of rate hikes coming this year. And exactly where that levels off remains to be seen, but we could easily imagine seeing interest rates go up by essentially 1.25% to 2% plus over the course of a couple of years, as you sort of aim for that neutral position where you're neither adding accommodation or essentially keeping your foot on the gas pedal, but you want to sort of let the car cruise on its own without adding accommodation in the economy.
Mark Hamrick, thank you.
Thank you.
Some members of Congress are moving to thwart the Chinese Communist Party's influence on U.S. corporations. Senator Marsha Blackburn and Marco Rubio have introduced the No Chinese Communist Surprise Parties Act. If passed, this new bill would require publicly traded companies in the United States to disclose certain information. They have to disclose the presence and governance of any CCP-affiliated organizations within their corporate structure. As of 2016, there were roughly 106,000 foreign firms in China, and around 75,000, that's over 70% of them, have established Communist Party units inside the corporate structure. On Friday, the Virginia House of Delegates passed a bipartisan resolution condemning the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Falun Gong practitioners. Here's the details.
H.R. 9 is a bill to recognize human rights abuses and educate Virginians about the evils of organ harvesting and forced slave labor prevalent in nations which the U.S. participated in trade.
Bill co-sponsor Kay Corey introduced two Falun Gong practitioners on the House floor, including Chunyang Wang, who displayed an item she was forced to make in a labor camp.
Chunyang Wang, a Falun Gong practitioner who was imprisoned in China for 7 years, tortured, and forced to labor making jackets to be sold in the U.S. and Europe, and she's got the jackets with her, so we can all know what not to buy.
Dr. Tatiana Denning testified before the Rules Committee last month with Chunyang Wang. Dr. Denning said Wang and others were tortured simply for following their belief in truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance.
It's benefited the holistic health of over 100 million people around the world, yet it's been persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party since 1999, including forced organ harvesting.
Dr. Denning said 20 of Chunyang's friends and relatives died from persecution. She described the resolution as an expression of our collective conscience, so we do not unwittingly take part in persecution through our dealings with Communist China.
It will prevent Virginia residents from becoming the unwitting accomplices to the murder of innocent people. It will also help educate our citizens that the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party are not one and the same.
The resolution states, state-controlled Chinese media inside and outside China used vilification and slander to dehumanize Falun Gong practitioners, to justify these brutal forms of persecution, and to instigate discrimination against them, even on American soil.
The U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning organ harvesting in 2016, but there's been very little media coverage. When people of Virginia started to find out about organ harvesting, they asked local officials to do something. The Virginia resolution condemns China's actions. It also requests that the governor and health department keep the citizens informed. Carrie Nunez, NTD News, Washington, D.C.
Republican senators are calling for the Capitol to reopen. The U.S. Capitol and congressional office buildings have been closed to visitors for almost 2 years. Tennessee Senator Bill Hagerty and 26 other Republicans have called to reopen these federal buildings in a new resolution. The resolution says that the U.S. Capitol and office buildings belong to the American people. It goes on to say it's illogical and unacceptable that most of America began reopening as early as 2020, while these buildings still remain closed. Some Democrats seem to be supporting the move. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi told NBC News last week that she hopes tours will restart soon. And that's all we have for you tonight on the Capitol Report. Thank you for tuning in. From Washington, D.C., I'm Steve Lance, and we'll see you again tomorrow.